Good evening. My name is Maryanna Deangelis. This is my video for Eco 112 Macroeconomics at the College of Staten Island. This is for video project number 2. And for our first question, we were asked, what is the difference between a trade deficit and a trade surplus? To provide a realistic example for each, does the United States operate at a trade deficit? And to justify your answer. So, a trade deficit is when the value of goods and services bought, which is an import, is more than the value of goods and services sold, which is an export. And a surplus would be exactly the opposite. It would be when the value of goods and services bought or imports is less than the value of goods and services sold or exports. And for my examples, I used the United States of America as an example of a trade deficit and China as an example of a trade surplus. The United States of America operates at a trade deficit. Since the 90s, we've generally imported more than we export. We've moved a lot of manufacturing to countries with lower labor costs, obviously resulting in more imports than exports. And we consume, just in general, we consume and spend and invest more than we create or provide or export. Whereas a country like China with lower labor costs would export more than they import. So they just, in general, provide more for other countries than they consume. For our second question, we were asked to describe pre-1930s conventional wisdom. How does this theory differ from Keynesian economics? And to provide a detailed discussion. Pre-1930s conventional wisdom viewed macroeconomics as the sum of individual actions and market outcomes, whereas Keynesian economics differs because it states that the behavior of the macroeconomy is more than the sum of just individual actions. The differences in these theories can be seen in the paradox of thrift. So, for example, individuals saving more when concerned about economic hard times. As a result of these individuals saving, when everyone cuts their spending to save, the combined reduction in spending depresses the economy. Businesses may react to the depressed economy by laying off workers. As a result, people are worse off than if they hadn't cut their spending. So basically, the paradox of thrift shows the differences in those two theories because the paradox of thrift shows how each individual consumer's actions can collectively create either a negative or positive effect on the macroeconomy, whereas pre-1930s conventional wisdom would have just looked at them at face value and only considered the sum of those individual actions. It wouldn't have considered everything else that goes into play afterwards of each individual's actions. For our third question, we were asked, what is the difference between monetary and fiscal policy? Describe how these tools are used to improve the economy. Explain what is meant by the business cycle. What is the highest and lowest point on the business cycle? Describe the difference between recessions and expansions. So monetary policy is the central bank's way of managing money and credit, whereas fiscal policy is the government's way of managing taxes and spending. So to answer the question of how do monetary policy and fiscal policy improve the economy, monetary policy can boost the economy because the central bank can lower interest rates. Lowering interest rates would encourage consumer spending, would also increase production and job creation, which would inevitably lower unemployment. To slow the economy, the central bank can raise the interest rates. That would discourage spending, but that would improve the economy in the case of high inflation. So it would slow spending down and ideally lower inflation. Fiscal policy can improve the economy by... To boost the economy, the government can increase spending. They can increase their spending on government services. They can spend on infrastructure. They could spend on transfer payments such as stimulus checks. The government could also decrease taxes, which would leave consumers with more disposable income. That would encourage spending and just promote overall economic growth. And to slow the economy, the government can reduce their own spending. They can decrease demand. They could also, on the other hand, increase taxes, which would reduce spending, thus bringing down inflation. So it's pretty much the same idea. It's just kind of how we get there. The business cycle is the natural fluctuation of economic activity. The highest point of the business cycle is the peak, and the lowest point of the business cycle is the trough. The difference in recessions and expansions is that recessions are periods where unemployment rises. Recessions reduce the standard of living. They increase poverty, cut corporate profits, whereas expansions are periods of economic upturn and unemployment decreases, consumer spending rises. So essentially, the business cycle explains the way the economy fluctuates. It shows how we could go from an expansion, so we would be expanding the economy, we would be on our way up, we would be creating more, spending more, there would be more jobs because money's moving, money's flowing, and we would eventually hit a peak, which would be our highest point at that point. And inevitably, again, things fluctuate, so inevitably we would go through a recession, which things would decrease, spending would decrease, unemployment would rise because there's just less overall spending to be had, and then we would hit our trough. So business cycle or the economic cycle just kind of shows how things are always moving in a good or a bad way for us.